Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.9, the 27th of April. We left off last week with waves of Red Army troops rampaging through every part of Berlin. The Berlin garrison forces had no hope of holding back the Soviet advance, and with the Russians having successfully breached the inner defense ring at multiple points, the remaining German troops had no option but to fall back towards the center of the city. Therefore, by the 27th of April, the Battle of Berlin was ready to move on to the next phase: the Red Army's assault on the center of Berlin and the Citadella district. At the recently captured Tempelhof Airport, for example, General Zhukov and General Katukov turned the airport into a forward operating base for the 8th Guards Army and the 1st Guards Tank Army. And from Tempelhof, they planned to launch their attack northwards over the central section of the Landwehr Canal. This canal represented the last major obstacle standing between Zhukov and Katukov's forces and the central governmental district. But in order to stage a successful crossing of the canal, their armies needed to first resupply, refuel, and reinforce. So the Soviets set themselves a target of turning Tempelhof Airport into a new forward operating base within just 24 hours. And in order to meet this tight schedule, 2,000 German women were rounded up from the southern suburbs of Berlin, and they were ordered to clear the runways and airfield of the burnt-out tanks and vehicles. As the Soviets consolidated their positions in Tempelhof, during the early hours of the 27th, the remaining German defending troops stationed in Neukölln retreated northwards across the Landwehr Canal into Kreuzberg. And here they hoped to regroup and establish new defensive positions along the northern bank of the canal. Further to the east in Kreuzberg, the remaining troops of the Nordland Panzergrenadier Division were engaged in a desperate fight to repel the advance of the Soviet 9th Rifle Corps in the area around the Görlitzer Bahnhof, whilst the Panzer Division Müncheberg deployed its remaining troops and tanks in a wide defensive line stretching from Görlitzer Bahnhof all of the way towards Alexanderplatz. In a normal world, the battered German forces would have been demoralized by the unstoppable Soviet advance. But news of the impending relief of Berlin by General Wenck's 12th Army was by now circulating amongst the frontline defending troops. Moreover, rumours were flying around regarding last-minute negotiations between the Western Allies and the Nazi leadership, leading many to believe that the Americans and the British would soon swoop into Berlin to join the Germans in their fight against the Soviets. Of course, these rumours were absolute tosh, but they served to raise the morale of the men on the front line, leading them to fight on even more tenaciously than before. The aide-de-camp from the Panzer Division Müncheberg, who we've featured before in our series, shared his experience on the impact of those rumours on the frontline soldiers. 3 times during the morning, we inquire, where is Wenck? Wenck's spearheads are said to be at Werder, which is about 30 kilometers away on the far side of Potsdam. Then we have a reliable release from the propaganda ministry saying that all of the troops from the Elbe front are marching on Berlin. At about 1100 hours, someone comes from the propaganda ministry, his eyes shining, with an even more reliable release straight from Secretary of State Naumann. There have been negotiations with the Western Allies. We shall have to make sacrifices, but the Western Allies will not stand by and let the Russians take Berlin. Our morale goes up enormously, and our contact says it is absolutely certain that we will not have to go on fighting for more than 24 hours, 48 at the very most. The truth was that neither Wenck nor the Western Allies were going to save Berlin. Moreover, what remained of the German army to the north of Berlin, including Steiner's forces, were being routed by Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front, preventing them from also breaking through to the remaining German garrison in the centre of Berlin. But whilst the Germans dreamed of salvation, the Soviet advance continued. To the west of Berlin, after several days of running battles between Soviet infantry and Volkssturm units and Luftwaffe cadets, Gatow Airport finally fell on the 27th of April. And following this, the western bank of the Havel River, running along the western border of Berlin, was also cleared of German troops. To the northwest of the city, the 1st Mechanized Corps and the 12th Guards Tank Corps from the 2nd Guards Tank Army finally cleared out all German resistance in the Siemensstadt area, and they reached the banks of the River Spree in Spandau. However, the 1st Mechanized Corps and the 12th Guards Tank Corps were prevented from advancing further, as almost all of the bridges over this section of waterway leading into the West End district had been blown by the Germans. Only a narrow footbridge remained, which was clearly unable to accommodate the multitude of Soviet tanks and heavy guns which wanted to cross. Luckily, the 35th Mechanized Brigade located an intact bridge close to the Ruhleben racecourse, which today is the location of the Ruhleben Waterworks, and so the large Soviet armoured force could proceed into the West End district. So these forces belonged to Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front, and as they crossed southwards into West End, they were met by the 55th Guards Tank Brigade from the 3rd Guards Tank Army belonging to Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. The significance of the two fronts linking up in the West End district cannot be overstated, as the Germans needed this western route out of the city to remain open, either for Wenck's 12th Army to enter Berlin from the west, or for the remaining Berlin garrison troops to break out from the centre. General Weidling therefore sent the remains of the 18th Panzergrenadier Division to assist the local German defence units in driving out the Soviet forces from the West End area. This fresh injection of German troops did cause problems for the Soviets, and the 55th Tank Brigade in particular had their lines routinely infiltrated by German incursions, which led to fierce fighting throughout the district. Meanwhile, the 3rd Shock Army's 79th Rifle Corps was struggling to make progress in its advance through Moabit, as the heavily built-up nature of the district meant that the German defenders had plenty of high-rise buildings from which they could rain sniper fire down onto the advancing enemy troops. As losses mounted for the Soviets, they once again switched tactics and started bypassing the heavily defended apartment blocks, choosing to isolate the defenders inside the buildings instead. After cutting off the exits of the building, all the Soviets had to do was pepper the windows with machine gun fire and wait for the Germans' ammunition and water supplies to run out. Once that happened, the tower block defenders usually surrendered en masse. The 79th Rifle Corps is one of the more famous Red Army units in the Battle of Berlin, as they had been given the objective of advancing through Moabit and striking south towards the central governmental district, in order to claim the ultimate prize, the Reichstag. However, this advance through Moabit was no cakewalk, as the 79th Rifle Corps was pinned down by the German 9th Fallschirmjäger Division, which was leading the motley Volkssturm and Hitler Youth units in a stubborn defense. Meanwhile, the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower was continuing to pump artillery fire down onto all Soviet forces moving through the Moabit, Wedding, and Gesundbrunnen areas. The fighting in these districts was unforgiving, as Wolfgang Karel, the infantry NCO serving in the Humboldt-Hain Flak Tower, reported. We were ordered to retake Wedding S-Bahnhof, which had been lost. We only got as far as Schönwalder Straße on the night of the 27th, for it was impossible to establish who was in front of us or to the left and right. Suddenly, we heard, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" and the Russians attacked over the railway embankment. I shouted, "Come on, let's get out of here!" The men fired, and then we rushed up the cellar steps. Up above, the Stalin organs met us with a rocket salvo, and we could hardly see the yard through the smoke. We reached the street and ran down Kunkelstrasse to Schönwalder Straße. In Schönwalder Straße, we had to cross the bridge over the Panke. It was about 4 a.m, and all we could see were some shadowy figures. I ran across to ask them where they came from, thinking they were a couple of our chaps, but discovered straight away that they were Russians. The accompanying Volkssturm and myself immediately took cover in the nearest building, and we opened fire on the Soviet stormtroops. Despite the heavy losses they were suffering, the 79th Rifle Corps pushed on, and by the end of the day they reached Stettiner Bahnhof, now known as Nordbahnhof. Once again, the Germans refused to give up the S-Bahn station without a fight, and the streets around the station were ravaged by bloody hand-to-hand fighting. Here, the Germans were forced to fire Panzerfausts at point-blank range at the Soviet riflemen, and if the Germans ran out of ammo, then they resorted to using rifle butts, knives, or shovels to beat back the Russian troops. To the east of the city centre, the 7th Rifle Corps from the 3rd Shock Army spent the entirety of the day desperately trying to dislodge German defenders from the Alexanderplatz, all the while sheltering from German artillery fired from the still active Friedrichshain Flak Tower. The Red Army's continuing struggles to take Alexanderplatz were proof that the German defenders here were well supplied, well entrenched, and highly motivated. Moreover, the Red Army's advance here was also being frustrated by the lingering presence of isolated German pockets of resistance in cellars, tunnels, and train stations, which prevented the Soviets from establishing an uninterrupted and firm front line. And more often than not, these German defensive positions could only be neutralized by a deadly combination of grenades, tank shells, and flamethrowers. On the other side of the River Spree, the 9th Rifle Corps from the 5th Shock Army managed to break the German defences around the Görlitzer Bahnhof in the afternoon, and they advanced through Kreuzberg, reaching Moritzplatz by the end of the day. To the south, General Zhukov's 8th Guards Army consolidated its hold on the northern part of the Schöneberg district, and they managed to clear out all German opposition south of the Landwehr Canal. By the end of the 27th of April, Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front forces had pressed their advance into the northern, eastern, and southern edges of the centre of Berlin. Meanwhile, Marshal Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front forces had continued their advance in the southwest and the west of the city, and the 3rd Guards Tank Army was engaged in bitter fighting with German troops defending the Schmargendorf S-Bahnhof, today known as Heidelberger Platz. and they also fought running battles in the nearby Hindenburg Park, now known as Volkspark-Wilmersdorf. In the park, the Soviet infantry was pinned down, as the Germans made good use of the open field of fire to pour machine gun fire into the ranks of enemy troops. However, the Soviets overcame this setback by calling in their artillery to blast the German defensive positions to pieces. But whilst the Soviets progressed through the park, they couldn't break down the German defences at the Schmargendorf S-Bahnhof. The defence here was being assisted by a group of Hitler Youth boys who were driving around the neighbourhood at high speeds in an officer's staff car. And from the car, they were firing Panzerfausts at any Russian tanks they came across. The boys carried out a series of hit-and-run raids on the Russians, knocking out several tanks and halting the Soviet advance for now. The Berlin garrison forces could see the writing on the wall, and so in anticipation of the impending Soviet attack on the Citadella, SS Brigadeführer Mohnke deployed a series of 105mm howitzers on the Gendarmenmarkt, on the Pariser Platz, and on Leipziger Straße. However, in another sign of the desperate situation the Germans found themselves in, it turns out that these howitzers only had 12 rounds available per gun, and thus the gunners were ordered to join the front line as regular infantry once they had fired all of their 12 shells. Meanwhile, the underground tunnel at the Stadtmitte U-Bahnhof provided the perfect location for SS Brigadeführer Krukenberg to set up a new headquarters for his Nordland Panzergrenadier Division. But Krukenberg's new HQ was hardly a fancy affair, as it was located in a derelict railway carriage. Plus, Krukenberg didn't have any electricity in his new headquarters, or a working telephone. However, his HQ was at least well stacked with food supplies, which had been commandeered from shops at the nearby Gendarmenmarkt. Krukenberg's Nordland Panzergrenadier Division had been fighting non-stop for days, and they had been thrown into the line against the Soviet forces time and time again. By now, they only had a handful of half-tracks, armoured personnel carriers, and tanks left. And in the absence of adequate ammunition for their machine guns and heavy guns, the men of the Nordland Division now armed themselves to the teeth with Panzerfausts, which they used not only as anti-tank weapons, but also as close combat weapons in house-to-house fighting. But it wasn't all bad for the Nordland Division, as they were also strengthened by a fresh batch of reinforcements in the form of a group of Latvian SS volunteers. Of course, it's pretty ironic that Hitler's dream of a German empire was being defended by groups of Latvians, Norwegians, Danes, and Frenchmen. But the presence of these foreign fighters and the contribution they made to the desperate defense of Berlin was remarkable. And the foreign SS volunteers will play a key role in the final days of the battle. As the fighting reached the center of Berlin, the Germans were enduring some truly atrocious conditions. Relentless Soviet shelling had smashed the few remaining street pumps, forcing the Berlin garrison troops to refill their canteens with water from the canals and rivers instead. The Berlin garrison forces had not slept in days, and an increasing number of soldiers were either collapsing from exhaustion or suffering mental breakdowns from the constant Russian bombardment. Of course, if a German soldier completely broke down and was unable to fight anymore, then SS death squads were always on hand to shoot anyone they accused of cowardice. And if a house dared to hang a white flag out of their window, then SS henchmen quickly stormed into the building and executed any men they came across. These truly were the end times for the Third Reich. In this series, we've looked in great detail at the political and military aspects of the fighting, and we've focused heavily on the actions of the soldiers, politicians, and generals. However, to really tell the story of the Battle of Berlin, and to do justice to the horrific consequences the fighting had on civilians, we have to look at the plight of the women of Berlin during the battle. Because, to be blunt, the women of Berlin suffered just as much as any frontline soldier. Firstly, by this point in the battle, there was nowhere for civilians to hide from the fighting, as every street was being ripped apart by a maelstrom of rounds, shells, and fire. Yet despite the fact that their streets, homes, and cellars had been turned into a war zone, the women of Berlin had no choice but to leave the safety of their air raid shelters on a daily basis. Leaving the shelter to fetch water from the pumps in the streets could lead to horrific injuries or death, because the act of standing in a queue, waiting for your turn to fill up a bucket of water, left you horribly exposed to Soviet artillery. Often, when a shell burst killed some of those waiting in the queue, the gaps simply reformed, and the people continued queuing for their turn to fill their buckets. Clearly, sentimentality, just like the water, was in short supply. And women, who were focused on the survival of their families, also had to brave Soviet shelling in order to wait patiently for the meager food rations which were handed out each day. Secondly, the Nazi regime also implored women to rise up and aid the defense of the city by joining the frontline units. This plea was a sign that in the face of its own destruction, the regime was content to throw away years of its own propaganda, which had long claimed that warfare was the domain of men. Within Hitler's Third Reich, women had been relegated to the home and to the kitchen. But now, they were being called up to fight? In the end, few women heeded the call, but this desperate plea for women to go to the front line was another sign that the facade of Nazism was crumbling. And thirdly, the greatest impact the battle had on the women of Berlin was the appalling wave of sexual violence they were subjected to by Soviet troops. Ever since East Prussia had been invaded by the Red Army, stories had spread by word of mouth from fleeing German refugees or through official Nazi propaganda that the advancing Soviet forces were using rape as a brutal tactic to terrorize German women in the territories they conquered. Many women in Berlin had, of course, heard of these stories, but they consoled themselves that, whilst these abuses might have occurred in the countryside, surely they wouldn't happen in the capital. After all, with so many witnesses present in a big city like Berlin, the soldiers would behave themselves, right? And even if one or two soldiers did commit rape, they would be quickly found and punished, surely. However, as the women of Berlin found out, this was not to be the case. As law and order in Berlin fell apart, and as the garrison forces retreated back into the center, huge swathes of residential areas across the city lay undefended. Thus, with no one to stop them, the victorious Soviet troops were keen to claim their spoils of war. Homes were ransacked, stores were looted, and women were taken as prizes. Of course, some Soviet soldiers behaved impeccably, and they treated the women of Berlin with respect and dignity. However, these soldiers were few and far between, as the overwhelming experience suffered by the women of Berlin was one of horror, degradation, and violence. As soon as Soviet forces entered Berlin, the women of Berlin started being hunted at night by roving bands of drunken soldiers hell-bent on punishing them for the crimes their German husbands, sons, and brothers had committed in the East. But whilst some of the rapes committed by the incoming Red Army soldiers were driven by revenge for previous atrocities visited upon the Russian people by the Wehrmacht, in many cases, Soviet soldiers simply committed their crimes because they had spent years fighting a brutal war, and as a result, they themselves had become brutalized and desensitized to violence. But whatever the reason behind the wave of violence, the women of Berlin quickly developed tactics to spare themselves from the worst of the atrocities. For instance, women often barricaded themselves into their flats or attics at night, only daring to venture outside in the early morning hours when the drunken soldiers were sleeping off the hangover of the previous night's exploits. Many women mucked up their faces with coal and covered their heads with old rags in order to look as unattractive as possible. Or they feigned illnesses, such as scarlet fever, in order to ward off the advances of the Russians. Whilst another survival tactic employed by some women in Berlin was to identify a senior Soviet officer and through hand gestures indicate that they wished to become his quote-unquote girlfriend. The hope was that this would grant them some level of protection from the lower-ranking soldiers. To really convey the horror of it all, I want to share with you an extract from the book A Woman in Berlin, which is a memoir from a German woman who was living in Berlin during the battle. The memoir, which was published anonymously in English in 1954, became perhaps the best-known first-hand account of the mass rape of German women by the Red Army. When the book was eventually published in German in 1959, it scandalized the German-speaking world, and the author was accused of besmirching the honor of German women. And as a result, the author refused any further editions of her memoir to be published during her lifetime. The identity of the author remained unknown until it was controversially revealed in 2003. But as she wished to remain anonymous, I won't name her in this podcast. Suffice to say, she was a German woman who worked as a journalist during the war in Berlin. The book is a powerful testament to those darkest of days in Berlin. And in this extract, the author describes how on the 27th of April, the Russians arrived in her street. In the evening, 3 Russian soldiers burst into the basement of the author's house, where the men, women, and children from her building were hiding. The Russian soldiers took stock of the civilians in front of them, and their attention fell upon the wife of the local baker. The memoir's author, who spoke some Russian, found an officer and tried to convince him to intervene and protect the baker's wife. Here, she recounts what happened next. The officer joins the conversation, not with a tone of command, but as among equals. Several times I hear the expression Ukaz Stalina, or Stalin's decree. Apparently Stalin has declared that this kind of thing is not to happen, but it happens anyway. The officer shrugs his shoulders. One of the 2 men being reprimanded voices his objection, his face twisted in anger. "What do you mean? What did the Germans do to our women?" He is screaming, "They took my sister!" and so on. I can't understand all of the words, only the sense. Once again, the officer speaks, calming the man down, slowly moving towards the door, and finally managing to get the men outside. The baker's wife asks, hoarsely, "Are they gone?" I nod, but just to make sure, I step out into the dark corridor. Then they have me. Both men were lying in wait. I scream and scream. I hear the basement door shutting with a dull thud behind me. One of them grabs my wrists and jerks me along the corridor. Then the other is pulling as well, his hand on my throat, so I can no longer scream. I no longer want to scream, for fear of being strangled. They're both tearing away at me. Instantly, I'm on the floor. Something comes clinking out of my jacket pocket. Must be my keyring, with the key to the building. I end up with my head on the bottom step of the basement stairs. I can feel the damp coolness of the floor tiles. The door above is ajar and lets in a little light. One man stands there, keeping watch, while the other tears my underclothes, forcing his way. I grope around the floor with my left hand until I find my keyring. I hold it tight. I use my right hand to defend myself. It's no use. He's simply torn off my suspender belt, ripping it in two. When I struggle to come up, the second one throws himself on me as well, forcing me back on the ground with his fists and knees. Now the other keeps lookout, whispering, "Hurry up, hurry up." I hear loud Russian voices. Some light. The door opens. 2, 3 Russians come in, the last a woman in uniform, and they laugh. The second man jumps up, having been disrupted in the act. They both go out with the other 3, leaving me lying there. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.